What if I told you that survival in the freezing medieval winter depended not on swords or castle walls, but on what was quietly bubbling in a cauldron over the fire? All the familiar images, knights, feasts, torches, lose their meaning when there is a blizzard outside and supplies of bread and firewood are dwindling by the day. In such times, it was not the strongest who survived, but those who knew how to cook and store food properly. The real struggle took place not in halls decorated with tapestries, but at the hearth. That was where it was decided whether there would be enough food to last until spring. People came up with ways to stretch their last grains, dried root vegetables, and cooked thick soups, where each spoonful meant another day of life. Even the cooking method was well thought out. It was not for nothing that the kitchen was called the heart of the castle. Watch the video to the end to learn how medieval cooks used the slow fire technique without fire, how food could continue to cook on its own, without fuel, and why this simple trick saved thousands of lives, becoming an invisible weapon in the winter war for survival. What if I told you that the most important secret to survival in the Middle Ages was not meat or bread, but a dish that never ran out? We're talking about soup, but not the kind you're thinking of. It wasn't just soup, but a perpetual pot that stood on the fire for weeks, sometimes months. New ingredients were constantly added to it as the family ate from it. It was the basis of nutrition, a living, ever-changing system. The concept of eternal soup was ingenious in its simplicity and effectiveness. The pot was never completely removed from the fire. It always remained warm near the smoldering coals. Every morning it was brought to a boil, adding whatever was at hand. It could be new vegetables, leftovers from yesterday's meal, or a handful of grain. In this way, not a crumb of food was wasted, and the flavor of the broth only became richer. The basis for such a soup was the most accessible and cheapest products that could survive the winter. The main ingredients were root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, and carrots, which could be stored in cellars for months. Onions and garlic were added for flavor and health. These vegetables gave their juices to the broth, making it thick and nutritious. Another important component was legumes, especially dried peas and beans. They did not need to be stored under special conditions and were incredibly filling. Soaked and cooked in a common pot, they turned into a thick porridge. This porridge was not only filling, but also served as a natural thickener for the entire soup. Grains also played a key role in filling the pot. Barley, oats, or even rye grains were added for density and calories. They boiled down, turning the soup into something between a soup and a porridge. Such food was slowly digested, giving a long feeling of fullness, which was critically important on cold days. Meat in a simple peasant's soup was the exception rather than the rule. Most often it was bones left over from cutting up meat or a small piece of salted meat for flavor. Sometimes small wild herbs gathered nearby were added to the pot. But even without meat, the combination of root vegetables, legumes, and grains made the dish surprisingly nutritious. This method of cooking had another, less obvious advantage. A constantly boiling or hot liquid was safe to consume. At a time when the quality of water was questionable, hot soup was guaranteed to be disinfected. This reduced the risk of disease in crowded and not always hygienic winter dwellings. In addition, the eternal cauldron saved fuel, which was vital in winter. There was no need to build a strong fire every time to cook food from scratch. It was enough to maintain a low smoldering of coals to keep the cauldron warm and bring it to a boil only once a day. This saving of firewood allowed valuable resources to be conserved for heating the home. Soup was not just food, but the center of family life. The whole family gathered around the hearth with the boiling pot. The aroma that filled the house was the smell of stability and survival. It was a warm, filling, and always available dish that literally kept the family from freezing and starving to death. Nowadays, this concept seems almost forgotten, but it demonstrates the incredible ingenuity of medieval people. They created a food system that was sustainable, efficient, and inexpensive. The eternal pot was a culinary anchor that kept them afloat in the harshest of times. We would love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about the concept of eternal soup? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about why salt was more valuable than gold in the Middle Ages? The answer is simple. Salt was the only reliable way to preserve food and survive the winter. Without refrigerators and canning factories, the only technology standing between harvest and famine was preservation. The main methods were salting, drying, and curing. Autumn was not only a time for harvesting, but also for mass preparation. As soon as the weather began to deteriorate, the race against time began. Any meat that was not intended for immediate consumption had to be preserved. The most common method was dry salting. The meat was rubbed with large amounts of salt, which drew out the moisture, and then placed in barrels. This process turned fresh meat into salted meat, a hard, incredibly salty, and long-lasting product. Such salted meat could be stored in a cool basement all winter without spoiling. It was the staple of the diet in the months when fresh meat was unavailable. The taste and texture, of course, left much to be desired, but it was the price of survival. The same was done with fish, especially in regions located near the sea or rivers. Huge catches of herring or cod had to be processed immediately. The fish was gutted, generously covered with salt, and placed in barrels. Salted fish was an important commodity and a major source of protein during the numerous fasts when meat consumption was restricted. Salt acted as a preservative, creating an environment unsuitable for bacterial growth. It literally dehydrated microorganisms, stopping the decay process. Medieval people may not have understood the microbiology behind this, but they knew the result very well. Salt was their invisible shield against food spoilage. In addition to salting, drying, and curing were also widely used. Meat or fish was cut into thin strips and hung in a dry, well-ventilated place. Sometimes this process was combined with smoking over a fire. The smoke not only gave the products a characteristic aroma, but also had additional preservative properties, repelling pests. Vegetables were also preserved, albeit in a slightly different way. Cabbage was finely chopped, sprinkled with salt, and placed under a weight. This started the fermentation process, which turned the cabbage into something similar to modern sauerkraut. This product was not only long-lasting but also incredibly healthy, preserving the vitamins that were so lacking in winter. Root vegetables, such as turnips and carrots, were most often simply stored in cool, dark cellars. They were covered with sand or straw to prevent them from drying out and sprouting. This simple method kept the vegetables fresh for a surprisingly long time. They were the basis for the very same eternal soup we talked about. Mushrooms and wild herbs collected in the summer were also dried. They were laid out in the sun or hung over the hearth. When dried, they took up almost no space and could be stored for years. In winter, they were added to soups and sauces to give the dishes flavor and aroma. Thus, all autumn activity was aimed at creating a salt fortress, a supply of canned food. The success of these preparations directly determined whether the family would survive the winter. It was hard, laborious work, but it gave confidence in the future. But preservation was only half the battle. What if I told you that this food was so hard that it couldn't simply be eaten? In the next chapter, we'll reveal the secrets of how people turned stone into bread. And what method of preservation do you think was the most reliable? I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of medieval cuisine. The fact is that all this food saved from spoilage, salted meat, dried peas, rock-hard grain, was practically inedible in its original form. Survival depended not only on the ability to preserve food, but also on the ability to bring it back to life. And this process was slow, requiring patience and knowledge of special techniques. Salted meat, which was the basis of the protein diet, was a real test for the teeth and stomach. Before going into the pot, it had to undergo a long process of soaking. Pieces of hard salted meat lay in cold water for hours and sometimes for days. The water was changed several times to remove excess salt and soften the fibers a little. Only after this lengthy procedure was the meat ready for cooking. It was placed in a pot with soup and simmered for hours over low heat. Salted meat never became as tender as fresh meat, but it gave the broth its rich, salty flavor, and most importantly, precious protein. It was food that had to be chewed for a long time. The same was true for dried beans. Peas, lentils, and beans were a cheap and accessible source of plant protein, but when dried, they were as hard as pebbles. They were soaked overnight or even for a whole day before cooking. Water slowly penetrated them, restoring their volume. After soaking, the legumes were cooked for a very long time. The most famous dish was peas potage, or pea soup. It was cooked until the peas were completely boiled down, turning into a thick, homogeneous porridge. This porridge was incredibly filling and warming, the perfect food for cold winter days. Grain also required special processing. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats were stored as hard grains. Before they could be turned into bread or porridge, they had to be ground. This was done either at mills or, more commonly in ordinary families, with hand mills. Every home had hand mills. It was hard, monotonous work, most often done by women. Every morning, enough flour had to be ground for the day's meals. This flour was coarsely ground, contained all parts of the grain, and was much more nutritious than modern refined flour. This coarse ground flour was used to bake bread, or, even simpler and quicker, to cook porridge. Oatmeal, or gruel, was the staple breakfast for many. It was cooked in water, sometimes with salt, or, if you were lucky, a spoonful of honey. It was a simple but very energy-dense food that provided strength for a hard day's work. Oats were one of the most important crops. They were unpretentious, grew in cold climates, and were very nutritious. Oatmeal porridge was essentially the same as soup, only based on grain. It was warm, thick, and slowly released energy. Thus, all medieval winter cooking was slow. The ingredients were soaked for a long time, ground for a long time, and cooked for a long time over low heat. There were no quick solutions or semi-finished products. Each meal was the result of a long and laborious process. This unhurried pace was dictated not only by the properties of the ingredients, but also by the need to conserve fuel. Slow simmering over coals was much more efficient than constantly maintaining a strong fire. People intuitively understood the principles of slow food long before the term was invented. If you enjoyed this unique look at medieval cuisine, please like this video. And be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new videos about the secrets of survival in the Middle Ages. What if everything you've been taught about medieval food is outdated? We're used to thinking of bread as an accompaniment to a meal, but in the Middle Ages, it was the opposite. Bread was not an accompaniment, but the foundation, the core around which the entire meal was built. Soup and other dishes were just things to eat with bread. Bread was the main source of calories for the vast majority of the population. It was eaten for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. A medieval person could eat up to 1 kilogram of bread a day if it was available. It was the energy that allowed them to work and simply not freeze in winter. Of course, bread was very different. White, fluffy bread made from finely ground wheat flour was a privilege of the rich. Peasants and townspeople ate simpler bread made from rye, barley, or a mixture of different grains. This bread was dark, dense, often sour in taste, but very filling. Bread baking was a centralized process in towns and villages where there were communal ovens. It was too wasteful to heat an oven for bread at home from a fuel perspective. Housewives kneaded the dough at home and took it to the baker, who baked the loaves for a small fee. This process was also an important social part of life. People exchanged news, rumors, and recipes at the oven. The baker was one of the most important and respected figures in the community. His skill determined whether people would have their main food product on the table. In the poorest families or in remote villages, bread was baked in the form of simple flat cakes over an open fire. The dough was rolled out and placed on a hot stone by the hearth or baked directly in the ashes. Such bread was coarse, but it could be prepared quickly and without a special oven. Bread served other purposes besides being a simple food. Stale bread that was several days old was not thrown away. It was used as a thickener for soups and sauces. It softened, giving the dish density and extra satiety. In wealthy homes, pieces of stale bread, known as trencher, were used as plates. Meat and sauces were placed on them. The bread absorbed all the juices. After the meal, these sauce-soaked plates were either eaten by the owners themselves or more often given to servants or the poor. Even breadcrumbs were put to good use. They were collected, dried, and used for breading or thickening dishes. In a household where survival was at stake, absolutely nothing went to waste. Every calorie counted. Thus, bread was the alpha and omega of the medieval diet. Its presence or absence determined the difference between satiety and hunger. The entire economy was largely built around grain cultivation and bread production. But bread and soup are useless if they are ice cold. In the next chapter, you will learn how people coped with heating food in harsh conditions. What kind of bread do you think was the most useful? The center of any medieval dwelling, from a simple hut to a majestic castle, was the hearth. It was the place where life, warmth, and light originated. In winter, its importance increased many times over, and it became not just a source of fire for cooking, but the true heart of the home. The hearth was essential for survival, and the ability to manage this resource properly became a key skill for anyone who wanted to keep their homes warm and ensure comfort for themselves and their families in the harsh winter conditions. Without it, a medieval home, especially during the cold months, would have been virtually uninhabitable. In simple peasant homes, the hearth was often located right in the center of the room, in the very heart of the dwelling. This was not only practical, but also symbolic. The fire was the center of life, and all family members usually gathered around it. The smoke escaped through a hole in the roof or seeped through the thatch roof. This design was extremely inefficient in terms of heat conservation, but it was simple and accessible to everyone. The house was usually filled with smoke, which not only created a specific atmosphere, but also had unexpected advantages. It preserved the roof beams, giving them additional strength and protecting them from decay. It was a kind of natural protection that our ancestors intuitively took care of. Cooking on such an open hearth was a real art that required not only skill, but also experience. The main tool on this fire was a cauldron, which was suspended over the flames on a chain or tripod. This allowed the hostess to adjust the height of the cauldron above the fire, which in turn allowed her to control the cooking temperature, from vigorous boiling to slow simmering. Thus, by controlling the cauldron, she could cook various dishes, including soups, broths, and porridges. It was here, in a simple cauldron, that the eternal soup was cooked, the staple of the medieval peasants and poor city dwellers. But the hearth was not only used for cooking. Flat bread was baked on the hot stones around the edges of the hearth, and it became the main bread for most people. Root vegetables, such as turnips, onions, and later potatoes, were baked in hot ashes. This method of cooking was simple but effective. The food retained its flavor and nutrients, and the meal itself was delicious and satisfying. It was a time-tested method that was suitable for all conditions and did not require complex kitchen tools. Controlling fire was not just a necessity, but a critical skill. The firewood that served as the source of this fire was a valuable resource and had to be harvested during the summer months. It was a laborious task that required a lot of effort. Chopping trees in the frozen winter forest was incredibly difficult, so every piece of wood was worth its weight in gold. Working with fire had to be done with great care, because even a small mistake could lead to tragic consequences. Fire was never lit in the house unnecessarily, and it was never allowed to burn too brightly. This was risky, as there could be highly flammable materials in the house, such as straw, wooden beams, or even the house itself. In order not to lose precious heat, The fire was usually not completely extinguished. At night, the coals were carefully raked and covered with ashes. In this state, they could smolder until morning. In the morning, it was enough to gently fan the coals and add a few dry twigs to reignite the flame. This saved not only precious time, but also resources, as the process of lighting a fire was labor-intensive and costly. Thus, the skill of working with fire was not limited to kindling it. It was also important to skillfully maintain the flame and minimize its loss. The hearth was not only a source of heat, but also a source of light, especially during the dark winter months when daylight hours were short. The family spent their evenings by the light of the fire, and it was the only place in the house that was lit. In the dark winter months, when there was no street lighting, the fire became the main source of light. Women usually spun or mended clothes by this light, and men often engaged in crafts, such as making tools or furniture. These evenings became a time for family gatherings and communication. The hearth was the place where all family members gathered to spend time together, warm themselves, and share news. The heat from the fire was vital for survival. People slept as close to the hearth as possible, often lying right next to it or in the same room to stay warm. The fire also served not only to provide warmth, but also to help people survive the harsh winters. Not only did it provide warmth, it was also an important element of safety and protection. But fire was also a great danger. In wooden and straw houses, fire was incredibly dangerous, and even a small spark could cause a fire. In medieval cities, there was a so-called curfew. It was a signal that all residents had to extinguish or cover their hearths to reduce the risk of night fires. During the dark hours of the day, this signal reminded everyone that they needed to be careful with fire. It was not just a law, but a safety measure that saved lives by preventing disasters. The call to extinguish fires was so important that compliance was mandatory for everyone, regardless of social status. Thus, the hearth was not just a place for cooking or heating, it was a multifunctional center of the home. It fed, warmed, lit, and brought the whole family together, providing not only physical comfort, but also emotional warmth. The ability to handle fire and maintain it in winter conditions was as important as the ability to grow crops or extract resources. It was a technology of life, honed over centuries, that had to be mastered in order to survive in the medieval world. The hearth served everyone, and if you could maintain it, you could survive. Here's a secret that has been passed down from generation to generation. We talked about saving fuel, but what if there was a way to cook food using almost no firewood? This technology, which today we would call slow cooking or thermos cooking, was well known in the Middle Ages. It was a method of cooking food using residual heat, often with the help of hay or straw. The principle behind this fireless method was ingeniously simple. The dish, most often soup or porridge, was brought to a rolling boil over an open fire. The pot had to boil for at least a few minutes to reach its maximum temperature. This required a relatively small amount of firewood. Immediately after that, the pot was tightly covered with a lid so that the steam would not escape. Then it was quickly removed from the fire and placed in a specially prepared place. This could be a wooden box, a basket, or simply a hole dug in the earthen floor. The main condition was that this place was filled with insulating material. The best insulator available to every peasant was hay or dry straw. The pot was literally buried in hay on all sides, top and bottom. A thick layer of insulation prevented the heat from escaping quickly. Inside this nest, the temperature remained very high for many hours. The dish continued to cook on its own, using the accumulated heat. It was the perfect method for foods that required long, slow simmering, just what was needed for tough, salted meat, legumes, and whole grains. The food did not burn or boil away, it slowly cooked to readiness. This method, known as haybox cooking, had many advantages. The main one was enormous fuel savings. By lighting a fire once in the morning to boil the pot, it was possible to have a hot, fully cooked dinner in the evening without adding wood throughout the day. It also freed up the housewife's time. She did not have to stand by the hearth all day, stirring the soup and making sure it did not boil over. She could do other chores around the house or in the fields, knowing that dinner was cooking itself. This was important during the short winter days when there was a lot of work to be done. In addition, it was simply safe. A pot hidden in hay did not pose a fire hazard, unlike an open fire. It could be left unattended for the whole day. The food in it did not spoil either, as the high temperature was maintained long enough to prevent the growth of bacteria. The same principle was used to keep cooked food warm. If hot soup had to be taken to workers in the fields, the pot was wrapped in thick cloth or straw. It was a medieval thermos that allowed lunch to be delivered warm even on a frosty day. This simple and elegant method is a striking example of how medieval people used readily available materials and basic laws of physics to solve vital problems. They did not have our technology, but their ingenuity allowed them to survive in the harshest conditions. But what did they drink to keep warm? In the next chapter, you'll learn about liquid calories that flowed like a river. Have you ever heard of this cooking method? Survival in winter is not only about food, but also about drink. And here, medieval man faced a serious problem. The quality of drinking water, especially in cities or densely populated villages, was extremely poor. Rivers and wells were often polluted, leading to disease. The solution to this problem was ale or beer. It is important to understand that medieval ale is not the same as modern beer. It was thick, unfiltered, and much less strong. It was brewed from barley, oats, or wheat and was more like liquid bread than just a drink. The brewing process was essentially a disinfection process. Water was boiled, killing most harmful microorganisms. Then grain was boiled in it to produce a sweet wort. After fermentation, the result was a drink that was not only safe, but also nutritious. Ale was a source of easily digestible calories, which were so lacking in winter. The grain base made it filling. Everyone drank it, men, women, and even children. For children and for everyday consumption, they brewed so-called small beer, a very low alcohol drink that was more of a thirst quencher. During the cold winter months, ale took on special significance. It was often drunk warm to keep warm. There were recipes for hot ale, to which spices were added that people could afford. For example, ginger or nutmeg in the case of wealthier households. In simple families, it could be just a warm drink. Unlike wine, which was mainly available in southern regions and was expensive, ale could be produced almost anywhere where grain was grown. Brewing was mainly a woman's responsibility. Every housewife had her own recipe and brewed ale for her family. Surplus ale was often sold to neighbors, which was an important source of additional income for the family. Taverns and inns were centers of social life where people gathered to drink a mug of ale, exchange news, and warm themselves by the communal fire. Storing ale was also an important task. It was kept in wooden barrels in cool cellars. This was easier in winter as the cold weather helped to preserve the drink. Ale was not just a way to quench thirst, it was an important part of the diet. From a survival standpoint, ale was the perfect product. It was safe, high in calories, and provided energy. In conditions where food might be scarce, a mug of thick, warm ale could replace an entire meal. It was real liquid food. Thus, brewing was not a pastime, but a vital technology. It transformed potentially dangerous water and hard grain into a safe, nutritious, and warming product. Without ale, surviving the medieval winter would have been much more difficult. Successful wintering began long before the first frosts. All summer, and especially autumn, were a time of intensive harvesting and preservation, not only of what was grown in the fields, but also of what the forest provided. For the people of the Middle Ages, preparing for winter was not just a necessity, but a real survival strategy. The weather at this time of year could change quickly, and if you didn't stock up on the necessary food in advance, winter could be a real challenge. All the resources that nature could provide were used to their full potential. Wild foods were especially valuable as they were an important addition to the meager winter diet. One of the most valuable natural resources that could be gathered in the fall was nuts. Forest nuts, walnuts, and beech nuts were collected in large quantities. These nuts were the perfect winter food. They are high in calories, rich in fats and protein, and did not require any special preservation. Nuts could be stored raw. They did not need to be cooked or prepared in advance. They could be stored all winter long, remaining in perfect condition thanks to their hard shells, which protected the kernels from pests and moisture. Nuts were stored in bags or boxes in a dry place so that they would not lose their properties. When winter came, nuts became an important part of the diet. They could be eaten as a high-calorie snack or ground up and added to baked goods and porridge. Nuts were a source of energy necessary to maintain body heat during the cold months. They provided the body with the necessary fats and proteins that were so sorely lacking during the winter food shortages. Especially on long winter evenings, nuts gave extra strength and endurance, helping people survive the cold days. Fruit also played an important role in the winter diet, although it did not keep as long as nuts. Apples and pears, especially late-ripening varieties, were the main fruits that could survive the winter. However, they were not eaten fresh in the same quantities as we do today. The main task was to preserve them so that they could provide people with the necessary vitamins and sweetness in winter. Various methods of storage and preservation were used for this purpose. The simplest way to preserve fruit was to store it in cool cellars. In such places where the temperature was stable and did not reach high levels of cold, fruit could lie for several months. Apples and pears were carefully laid out on shelves, often sprinkled with straw or hay to prevent damage from contact. Under such conditions, they retained their freshness until midwinter, providing people with much-needed sweetness and vitamins. However, this was not enough for long-term storage. Another popular method was drying. Apples and pears were cut into thin slices and dried, usually in the sun in dry weather or near a cooling hearth on cold days. This method was quite effective and took up little space. Dried fruits could be stored in bags or boxes and took up much less space than fresh fruits. Moreover, drying significantly increased the shelf life of the products. In winter, dried fruits were used to make compotes or simply soaked in water to be eaten as a dessert or added to porridge and baked goods. Of course, honey was the main sweetener of the era. Unlike sugar, which was an incredibly expensive imported commodity, honey was a locally produced product available in almost every household. Honey harvesting was an important autumn activity for many families, as it was not only a delicious addition to food, but also an important source of energy. Local beekeepers kept hives on their farms, and honey harvesting became a significant part of autumn work. It was not only a tasty product, but also a valuable source of quick energy that was used in everyday life. Honey was added to porridge, baked goods, and drinks, and a hot drink with honey was the best remedy for colds and a warming agent on frosty evenings. Honey was so valuable that it was used not only for food, but also as a preservative. Thanks to its antibacterial properties, it did not spoil for years, even if it was stored in unfavorable conditions. Sometimes fruits or nuts were covered with honey, thus creating long-term reserves. It was an expensive pleasure, but it allowed food to be kept in perfect condition without losing its nutritional value. Even wild berries such as hawthorn or rosehip were picked and dried. These berries were often used to make herbal teas, which were not only delicious, but also healthy. Rosehip, for example, was an excellent source of vitamin C and could help fight winter ailments such as colds or vitamin deficiency. Brewed in hot water, these teas enriched the winter menu and became an integral part of folk medicine. Every product that could be found in the forest was put to use. It was a kind of survival strategy, to waste nothing and make the most of all the resources that nature could provide. This strategy of maximizing the use of all available resources was the key to survival in the harsh conditions of winter. It required enormous effort and foresight. It was important to know the forest, to understand which plants and berries were useful, and how they could be preserved for a long time. A mistake in this matter could be very costly, as a lack of food or vitamins during the winter could lead to illness, weakness, and even death. It was not for nothing that there was a whole culture of harvesting and preserving, passed down from generation to generation. where each family knew its own methods, secrets, and traditions. It was an important part of rural life on which survival depended. Medieval people intuitively understood the importance of preparation, and even in the most difficult conditions, they could find ways to survive the harsh winter, thanks to their labor and ability to use natural resources. No matter how abundant, supplies would be useless if they could not be preserved. In an era without refrigerators, simple but effective structures such as basements, cellars, and pantries served as harvest storage. This was true survival architecture. The basement or cellar was perhaps the most important part of the house in terms of food storage. Its main value lay in its stable low temperature and darkness. The earth itself is an excellent insulator, so the cellar was cool in summer and, more importantly, not too cold in winter. The temperature in a well-built cellar remained just above freezing. These were ideal conditions for storing root vegetables. Turnips, carrots, parsnips, and beets were placed in boxes with sand, or simply on the earthen floor. The humidity and coolness prevented them from drying out or sprouting. Barrels of salted meat and fish were also stored here in the cellar. The coolness slowed down any remaining spoilage processes and prevented the salt from melting. Barrels of ale and wine were also kept in cellars, as a stable temperature was important for the proper maturation and storage of beverages. If the basement was a place for wet and cool storage, then the pantry or attic served as a place for dry storage. Pantries were usually located in the house itself, in a cool but most importantly, dry and well-ventilated place. This is where items that were sensitive to moisture were stored. The main treasure of the pantry was grain. It was kept in large wooden chests or trunks. The lids had to fit tightly to protect the supplies from rodents and other pests. Losing the grain supply meant starvation, so it was guarded like the apple of one's eye. Here in a dry place, bags of flour were stored if the grain had already been ground. Dried herbs, mushrooms, and bundles of onions or garlic were stored suspended from the ceiling. This ensured good air circulation and prevented the products from becoming damp and rotting. Dried fruits and nuts were also stored in the pantry in woven baskets or clay pots. It was important to ensure a constant flow of fresh air to prevent mold from forming. For this purpose, small ventilation windows covered with a thin fabric were often made in the walls of the pantries. Cheeses, if any, were also aged on shelves in cool pantries. They were regularly turned over and rubbed with salt to form a protective crust. Butter was stored in clay pots covered with a layer of salt water to prevent it from going rancid. The organization of these storage facilities was a science in itself. The lady of the house had to know exactly where everything was, what condition the supplies were in, and how to use them properly. She was a true logistics manager on whom the well-being of the entire family depended. These seemingly simple structures, the cellar and the pantry, were no less important than the walls and roof of the house. They were a buffer between the family and the unpredictable outside world. They were a guarantee that the hard work of harvesting would not be wasted. It may seem paradoxical, but in the midst of the harshest and hungriest winter, medieval people held feasts. Midwinter, the time of the winter solstice and Christmas, was a time of feasting. This was not reckless extravagance. It was a deliberate survival strategy. First, it was an important psychological moment. The long, dark, cold months had a depressing effect on people. Hard work, monotonous food, and constant cold were exhausting. The holiday was a bright flash, an opportunity to rest, have fun, and get a boost of positive emotions. It was a necessary respite that gave people the strength to hold out until spring. Gathering together, music, dancing, and most importantly, abundant food, all of this was a powerful remedy for despondency and apathy. It was a reminder that life goes on. Secondly, the winter feast had a purely practical, economic reason. By the middle of winter, it became clear how much food was left. At the same time, this was the period when some of the livestock, which was already difficult to feed until spring, was slaughtered. This provided a rare opportunity to eat fresh meat. The feast was a way to use up the food that might not last until spring. It was a time when the best barrels of ale were opened, stored honey was taken out, and pies were baked from the best flour. It was a calculated burst of consumption before the inevitable hungry spring. The festive table was laden with dishes that were not seen on ordinary days. Roast meat, if available, elaborate pies, sweet pastries. Even soup became rich during these days. More meat, spices, and cream were added to it. The communal meal also had enormous social significance. The entire community, the village or feudal estate, gathered together. This strengthened social ties and smoothed over conflicts. The lord, who hosted a feast for his vassals and peasants, demonstrated his generosity and strengthened their loyalty. For ordinary people, it was an opportunity to share food with each other. Those who had a surplus of one product could exchange it for another. Celebrating together was a form of mutual support, a guarantee that no one would go hungry alone. Of course, the abundance of food was relative. A peasant's feast and a king's feast were incomparable, but the principle was the same. Winter was not only a time of economy, but also a time for one well-planned celebration. This celebration was an investment in the future. Well-fed, rested, and encouraged people were more resistant to disease in the hardships of the remaining winter. It was an injection of calories and morale that helped them hold out until the first warmth of spring. We can see that survival in the medieval winter was a complex, multi-layered system. It was not just a struggle against the cold, but a daily painstaking task based on deep knowledge, foresight, and incredible ingenuity. From eternal soup and salt preservation to cooking in hay and managing cellar stocks, every element of this system was vital. These people did not have our technology, but they possessed something that we may have lost: a deep understanding of nature, the cycles of the seasons, and the properties of food. They did not throw anything away, using every resource to its fullest potential. Their food was simple, but it was honest, nutritious, and most importantly, it allowed them to live. By studying their methods, we see that many modern ideas such as slow food, zero waste production, and fermentation are actually as old as the world itself. These are not just historical curiosities, but timeless lessons in sustainability and the wise use of resources. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. Perhaps you are interested in medieval medicine, construction, or crafts. Your opinion is very important to us. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our new research on how people actually lived in the past.